In a bustling city where skyscrapers competed in height and avenues echoed with impatient horns and hurried conversations, Thomas, a 42-year-old homeless man, wandered silently among the busy crowds. He was a discreet shadow, almost invisible to passers-by, but his gaze, lively and observant, captured everything. Each building facade, each advertising poster, and even the fleeting expressions on faces, nothing escaped his attention. Formerly employed in a small company that had gone bankrupt, Thomas had seen his life gradually turned upside down, carried away by circumstances that he had been unable to control. Since then, he had learned to read the world differently. Where others saw only agitated crowds, he discerned stories. In the narrow streets or public benches, he perceived fragments of life that no one seemed to notice. Despite his precarious situation, Thomas carried within him an inner wealth that he maintained like a fragile fire. Keen instincts and attention to detail allowed him to spot opportunities to survive in this often unforgiving world. A coin dropped from a pocket, a bag forgotten on a bench, a cardboard box strong enough to make a temporary shelter. He saw everything. He especially loved the moments when the tumult of the city calmed down, late in the evening, when the neon signs projected an almost dreamlike light onto the deserted sidewalks. These moments of calm were for him a mental refuge, an opportunity to dream of what his life could have been like. But for now, he continued to walk these familiar streets, a silent observer, witness to a world that seemed to have forgotten him. One morning, as the city awoke to a soft, golden light, Thomas sheltered behind a container, enjoying the first warmth of the day. The streets, still quiet, began to bustle with the arrival of the first workers, the cafes opening their doors and the cars setting off in a well-practiced choreography. It was then that an unexpected movement caught his attention. Across the street, an elegant woman squatted next to a luxury car. His precise and concentrated gestures stood out in this lively setting. It only took Thomas a few seconds to recognize Isabelle Delacroix, one of the city's most prominent figures. Always impeccably dressed, Isabelle embodied elegance and power. He had often seen her on the covers of magazines, in the arms of her husband, Eric Delacroix, a financial magnate. However, the scene unfolding before her eyes had nothing to do with the smooth and glamorous image she usually projected. She held a small tool between her manicured fingers, sliding it with surprising dexterity under the car's chassis. Thomas narrowed his eyes, his keen instinct telling him that he was witnessing something much more serious than a simple repair. The brakes. She was manipulating the brakes. The precision of her gestures, the intensity of her gaze, everything indicated that she knew exactly what she was doing. Thomas, hidden behind the container, watched with fascination, but also a touch of concern. Why was Isabelle Delacroix, known for her impeccable looks and envied status, sabotaging this car? Then his gaze fell on the license plate, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He immediately recognized Eric Delacroix's car. Once her act was finished, Isabelle stood up, elegantly smoothing her dress. She glanced around quickly, her eyes scanning every corner of the street to make sure no one had seen her. Then, with disconcerting confidence, she walked towards a black sedan parked a little further away. She got inside, and the vehicle quietly disappeared into the gathering traffic. Thomas stood frozen in place, torn between shock and perplexity. The contrast between Isabelle's cold elegance and the calculated act she had just committed left him speechless. Why was she attacking her own husband? Was it an act of revenge, a ploy in a power struggle, or something even darker? He took one last look at Eric's car, his thoughts colliding. What he had just seen could have tragic consequences, and he was now the only witness. Yet what could a man like him, homeless and invisible to the world, do when faced with a woman as influential as Isabelle Delacroix? A few minutes later, as the traffic intensified and the city awoke to a typical morning bustle, Eric finally came out of the neighboring building. He was dressed in his usual suit, impeccable and tailored, a powerful and respected businessman. He quickly crossed the sidewalk, his gaze already lost in everyday thoughts as he headed towards the car in question, indifferent to the noises around him. Thomas, hidden about 10 meters away, observed the scene with increasing tension in his chest. The time had come. A thrill of adrenaline shook Thomas. He knew he had no more time to waste. Eric was going to get in the car, and if he did, he was putting himself in serious danger. Without thinking, he rushed out of his hiding place, weaving between parked cars and crossing the street at full speed, his heart racing. "Sir."
"Wait."
"Don't start this car." The brakes, they were sabotaged. His voice, at first hoarse and disordered, rose into the air, hitting Eric head-on. The man stopped in his tracks, a look of puzzlement crossing his face, before his eyes landed on Thomas. He frowned, visibly surprised and suspicious. The idea that a stranger, a homeless person at that, could give him a warning seemed absurd. "What? Are you sick? Do you really believe what you're saying?" But despite the expression of disdain that briefly crossed Eric's face, something in Thomas's gaze made him hesitate. Maybe it was the palpable fear emanating from him, or that urgent glint in his eyes, but for some reason Eric remained frozen, his attention captured by the homeless man's words. A short breath escaped Thomas's lips, and before he even understood what he was doing, he was already heading towards the hood of the car, determined to prove what he had just said. Affirm. Eric, still doubtful, nevertheless allowed himself to be carried away. They both leaned over the engine, the silence between them weighing heavily. The traffic noise in the background seemed to fade away, as if the world had paused. Thomas pointed at the cables and metal parts, and Eric, after a moment of silence, began to examine himself, nervously. His hands tightened on the brakes, and soon he had a jolt of realization. The cables had been cut expertly. Deliberate sabotage. Eric's eyes widened, his face turning pale as he finally understood the gravity of the situation. Deep anger mingled with confusion, and the anxiety of imminent danger struck him with a force he had not anticipated. "It's impossible. Who would do that? For what?" Eric's words were lost in the tumult of his thoughts, but Thomas didn't take the time to respond. He knew they didn't have a second to lose. Eric, still in shock, rushed to his cell phone, immediately calling the police. His voice shook as he explained the situation, his gaze never leaving the car he had almost gotten into, a shiver of horror passing through his body. Yes, there was sabotage. The brakes were cut. "I want an investigation immediately." Thomas, out of breath and nervous, took a few steps back, observing the scene. The situation was now beyond his control, but he knew that having acted, having alerted Eric in time, had perhaps saved a life. A slight feeling of pride rose in his mind, but he didn't have time to savor it. Now the police would arrive, and Thomas, once again, risked becoming invisible to everyone, as he had always been. But that morning he had acted, and that was enough for him. When the officers arrived on the scene, the atmosphere was electric. Eric, still in shock, explained the situation in a trembling voice, his eyes remaining fixed on the car whose brakes had been sabotaged. His hands, still clenched, shook slightly as he recounted the events that had led to this moment of pure anguish. Thomas, for his part, stood back, his gaze both vigilant and worried. He knew that what he had seen could change everything, but he didn't dare hope too much, thinking that his homeless words would surely be ignored or minimized. However, he forced himself to relate, with as much clarity as possible, what he had observed. The sabotage scene, the tool, and his intuition which had told him to warn Eric. The officers took quick notes, with one carefully inspecting the tool found near the car. The instrument was small but effective, apparently designed to manipulate vehicle parts without leaving obvious marks. After a few moments of searching, one of the agents took out a latex glove and rubbed the object, before placing it in a transparent bag. The prints left on the tool were compared to databases, and in less than an hour, a shocking result was obtained. The fingerprints belonged to Isabelle Delacroix. The police immediately went to her house. Isabelle, initially surprised by their visit, tried to defend herself by invoking her social status and her husband's reputation. But when the police showed him the results of the investigation and the damning evidence, his face fell. She was trapped. During the interrogation, Isabelle initially resisted, seeking to minimize her actions and justify her behavior with silent rage against her husband. But the intensity of police pressure eventually made her give in. She finally admitted, in a trembling voice, what she had planned. She had sabotaged the brakes of Eric's car with almost clinical precision. Her goal was to cause a seemingly natural accident, a tragic incident on the road, where her husband would die without questions being asked. She had thought about every detail, the time of departure, the ideal moment when the road would be deserted. Everything was orchestrated so that the accident seemed inevitable. The reason for this act? The inheritance. Isabel deeply wanted to escape the heaviness of a costly divorce, and above all, the public scrutiny that went with it. She thought that Eric's death, instead of a divorce, would allow her to keep her entire fortune, thus avoiding years of legal proceedings that frightened her. But she had not anticipated the intervention of a man like Thomas. A simple homeless man, invisible to everyone, who, against all odds, had foiled his dark intentions. The latter, an observer of the smallest detail, had seen what she believed to be a perfect act of manipulation and deception, and had interrupted it before it was too late. Isabel, faced with the gravity of her act, realized too late that her careful planning was worthless in the face of a man who, despite everything, had a keen sense of justice. The agents did not hesitate for a moment. They arrested her on the spot, their movements precise and rapid, handcuffing her firmly before taking her unceremoniously towards their vehicle. Isabel, whose once confident gait was now jerky and trembling, felt suddenly stripped of all her control. His hands were trapped in the cold handcuffs, and despite his attempt to stand up, a feeling of helplessness crushed his being. She could no longer hide anything, no longer manipulate anything. The illusion of perfection, of the flawless life that she had carefully constructed for herself, collapsed in an instant. Eric's face, still marked by astonishment, silently observed the scene. His eyes never left Isabel, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. He looked at her, this woman he had married, whom he had loved, with whom he had shared years of his life. How could he not have seen this coming? How could he have been so blind to her schemes? He felt anger grip him, a deep, visceral anger. Against her, against himself, against this situation which was beyond him. How could Isabel get there? Him, a man who had believed in his marriage, who had put his trust in the person he thought he knew. But beyond the anger, he also felt a strange relief. That of knowing that he was no longer in the shadow of his own lie, that of the brutal realization that he had escaped death, that the weight of doubt, of silence, had been lifted from him. But this relief was tinged with shame. The shame of having allowed herself to be manipulated, of having ignored the signs, of having been blinded by the perfect image that she had carefully cultivated. This mixture of anger, relief, and shame was visible in his eyes, a silent struggle playing out behind his gaze. He felt like he had been betrayed, not only by her, but also by his own naivety. The officers took him away from him, and as he saw Isabel disappear into the police car, Eric felt like an emptiness settling inside him. He knew this emptiness well, a sort of weariness which was not new, but which today took on a more painful form. A chapter in his life was finally closing, but not in the way he had imagined. He didn't know if this relief would last or if it would haunt him for years. But what he knew was that his life was going to have to start again on a new basis, that this page was going to be turned, not because of his choices, but because of the decisions she had made in his place. Deep down, a question persisted: how to rebuild oneself after such a betrayal? How do you move forward when you discover that everything you believed in was just a mirage? But for now, all Eric could do was take a deep breath and watch Isabel disappear into the horizon. A chapter definitively closed, but a new book that opened in a reality that he had not chosen. He found himself alone, in a world he thought he knew, but where he was now a stranger. The story quickly made headlines, capturing public and media attention. The story of Isabel's betrayal, her Machiavellian plan, and the heroic intervention of Thomas, a homeless man, unleashed a wave of discussions on justice, morality, and the condition of the most deprived. Eric, grateful to the man who had saved his life, made a decision that would change not only his life, but also that of Thomas. Indeed, he could not simply ignore the heroic act he had just experienced. The relief and gratitude he felt toward Thomas was immense, but he also felt a deep desire to offer him a chance to start fresh, a gesture of solidarity in a world that is too often cruel. Eric invited Thomas to move into the accommodation he offered him, far from the street and the precariousness that had long defined his daily life. On top of that, he offered her a job in the family business, a job that would allow her to rebuild herself, regain dignity and independence. He also offered him financial assistance, a sum sufficient for him to start a new life, without the chains of poverty and social rejection. This gesture went well beyond a simple reward. It was a real outstretched hand, a chance to rewrite its history. As for Isabel, her world collapsed under the weight of her actions. After her arrest, she was charged with attempted murder, but the accusations went well beyond this single fatal attempt. Her betrayal, her manipulations, and her lies were exposed. The trial was expected to be long and high-profile, and Isabel's image, once a symbol of wealth and elegance, was irreparably tarnished. Society, shocked by the depth of her cynicism, judged her harshly. The media also turned to Thomas, whose discretion and modesty seemed to belie the hero label attributed to him. When questioned by journalists, he responded with a simplicity that was striking in its sincerity. With impressive calm, he declared, "I only did what was right. No matter who you are, no one deserves to lose their life because of greed." His words resonated in the minds of many listeners, who realized that sometimes courage and justice can emerge from the most unlikely places. Thomas, homeless among the homeless, a man rejected by society, had acted with more humanity than those who considered themselves superior. By saving Eric, he had not only avoided a tragedy, but he had reminded everyone that you cannot judge someone by their appearance, their social condition, or their status. The real hero was not the one who wore an impeccable suit or had a fortune to his name, but the one who acted according to his conscience, whatever the cost. As the weeks went by, the gratitude towards Thomas grew. He became a symbol of hope for many, a reminder that redemption is possible, even for those who seem to have lost everything. His story was shared in schools, conferences, and public discussions on social justice. People began to think about how they viewed others, their snap judgments, and how they could change their own perceptions of the most vulnerable. So a homeless man became an unexpected hero. Through his act of courage, Thomas demonstrated that it is possible, at any moment in life, to do what is right and change the destiny, not only his own, but that of others. And in this story of betrayal and redemption, he reminded society that sometimes true greatness lies in the simplest, most human actions.